Welcome to our Free Speech Zone, where we do a deep dive into trauma and reintegration. This is Combat Citizen. Welcome back to the Combat Citizen Trauma and Reintegration Podcast, where I actually take that slower than I usually done. So, haven't tripped over my words, which is great. Been practicing. Practicing at home, it's great. But anyways, that aside, thank you everybody for listening and following, both on video and also audio. So thank you for that. Thank you for the shares and likes. And also, I just want to give props up to the our sponsor, Battle Box, which is a hard case carrying case for essential oils, those kind of things. Also, your cell phone, those older style cell phones, smaller. We were even thinking it might be able to carry a gun. Might be. We'll check it out. But you can find it on battlebox.co. That's C-O, not C-O-M. It's battlebox.co. So anyways, thank you for your shares and listens. So with that being said, we're back on an episode with another veteran. Finally, we've been doing a lot of episodes just to fill it, to be able to have the episodes weekly, but be able to have a veteran on the podcast and kind of really get back to the original focus of the podcast, being able to bring on a veteran.
Let the man speak.
Okay, so we have Gavin here, who's Marine. We can't say prior because he's always a Marine. So, anyways, I'll give it to you, Gavin. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's always funny when you say that, because whenever you see a Marine who's done some unfortunate thing in the news, they're like, and this Marine who went to Paris Island at this time, his senior drill instructor was, it's never like just the Marine. They've got to give like the whole autobiography of the person.
Oh yeah, you have to start off with everything. Yeah.
Whereas like if it's a soldier, they're like, oh, this soldier did this terrible thing, and on to the news, Bill. It's always so strange.
Let's continue on to the next one.
Yeah.
Sure. So is there any validity to that? Like, so with anybody that's in any other branches, we're prior, but then with Marines, you guys are always a Marine?
Always the Marine. I think it's just that, it comes down to the fact that there's the stigma attached that the Marines are just so upper echelon all the time that, it just kind of carries us through the entirety of our lives.
Sure.
I don't know how to explain it much more than that, but it's one of those reasons why I don't have like the typical like prior service beard and constantly wearing like 511s, because it's also how I stay in shape, because I never want someone to be like, oh, you were a Marine, and then they kind of like look at you up and down. They're like, how long ago was that? And I love that fact, but
I completely understand. Yeah. I don't wear 511 shirts, and I'm not the beard kind of guy. I've thought about it, but I'm like, no, I'm good. I mean, there's some guys I know, they're like, their beards are all the way down to here, and you're just like, okay, that's cool. But yeah,
I love it, but I'd have to disappear from humanity for like a good month and a half to actually have something that looks awesome. And funny enough, like I know I'll probably get hate mail or something for this, but like half the time I look at them and I'm like, dude, you look like the Taliban. Like, why do you have this shaggy beard? At least get it like, you're not in ZZ Top. Like, come on, like make it look cool.
Just give you a guitar, and if you want to play, no, totally. or the mountain men. Are you wanting to be a mountain man?
Yeah, well,
I'm-
you know, there's that lumberjack look too that goes along
So,
with the veteran.
So Andy actually has a beard, but it's not a ZZ Top beard.
Nice.
I'm feeling attacked right now, guys. I'm just being real.
I can't see you, so I wouldn't have made that comment otherwise.
No, he has a wonderful beard. It's not a long ass, like beard. It's an actual, nicely done. So there
Gavin,
does that redeem us?
Gavin, what are some of the traits that you think of when you think of like, okay, don't be defined by the beard or the attire or anything like that. Like for you, what does it mean to always be a Marine?
Oh, that's a good one.
I think it really comes down to we have this thing that I'm sure the other branches have. We call it intestinal fortitude. It's one of those lovely phrases, and that really just goes down to kind of the honor kind of side of things about, doing the right thing at all times, even when people aren't looking out for you. And that was kind of the point, was that as a Marine, you're supposed to have the intestinal fortitude to do the right thing at all times, no matter who's watching you or where you're going or what you're doing with your life. And so I think that's one thing that I've really kept. I'm in professional sales and sales development, and I try to create credibility and integrity with every interaction I have. So it kind of is just second pat for me. But I'd say that's one of the biggest keys, I think. Good question.
Yeah, Andy does shell out some good ones every once in a while.
Well, I'm just the civvy back here, and so I have serious questions for you guys sometimes.
Yeah, and that's the joy of having Andy, because I can ask questions and then Andy's like, "Oh, wait. I'm a civvy. I want to ask this question." And I'm like, "Dude, go for it." I'm like, I mean, there's only a certain amount of questions that I think I can ask, and it's nice to have some other perspective. So
For sure.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm a little curious about one more.
Yeah.
Do you keep a carry weapon on you, or is that not something that you've kept outside of the military?
I have and I haven't. I guarantee you I always have a knife on me regardless. But I mean, I've had my CCW, I let it lapse. I've got 2 small children. So my wife is not anti-gun by any means, but she's always very cautious about my handguns and rifles. And I'm old school. I also have a crossbow just in case everything goes to hell. So
Man,
Yes.
I tend not to keep anything on me except when I travel. Like that's a must-have. And then here in lovely Ohio, all I got to do is put my name instead of copying my DD-214, and I can have my CCW anytime I want. So I don't know. I live in a world, thankfully, at least in like my suburban life, that there's not too many reasons for me to carry. And considering COVID, I'm not going anywhere. So I have no. I think also the juxtaposition of that is, if you've had good CCW instructors, they always talk about the hero stance, and the fact of the matter is, if you're concealed carry and you get in an interaction, you never know what really could be going on. They had a lovely vignette that I used to talk about, which was you kind of walk into a gas station, go to the bathroom, and you come out, and there's 2 guys with pistols pretty much staring at each other, and you, the hero, want to figure out like which one do you concentrate on, and you wind up creating a situation where you shoot like a plainclothes or undercover cop, and then you're gonna have to like own up to that. So I think sometimes concealed carry is almost a detriment depending on where you're living, because God forbid you get into an altercation, they're going to take your piece. I know a lot of guys who, when I was doing private security work, they lost those guns forever. Even once they got cleared, it was just, someone in the armory saw that piece and it was gone. And I'm famous for carrying my great grandfather's World War I Colt 45. And so that's not my concealed carry weapon anymore. But in my opinion, there's no better security than a 45 round versus my 9mm. But it'll always depend on where you can place those rounds at the end of the day anyway.
Sure.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
I think that makes complete sense from a civilian standpoint, because I don't even know, like, if I'm going to carry something, if it's not someone threatening me personally, I probably wouldn't do anything with it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it just, I would honestly think it'd be situation to situation too, you know,
Yeah.
but
It's very much situation dictates, but also at the end of the day, even most people who serve in the military don't have enough practice time with drawing a concealed weapon fast enough to actually make the difference between, you know, possibly getting injured or hurt yourself. And that's something I've tried to educate a lot of my civilian friends on. What gun should I have? Well, what fits well with your hand? You know,
Sure.
at the end of the day, you know, you could have some hand cannon. If you got tiny hands, that's not going to do well for you. But at the end of the day, if you can't draw fast enough, pull up your shirt, pull back, cross draw, you know, you want to be a cowboy, whatever it is, if you haven't put in the time and effort and practice to draw quickly, you're in a huge amount of trouble, because if you've got some, we'll just say, crazed person coming after you, they can cover ground very quickly. You've got like 3 seconds to pull up and put a round on someone. And for all people in the concealed carry world, you know, you shoot to kill. There's no shoot to wound. There's no shoot to maim. It's, I was in fear of my life, and that's why I shot that person in the face or two to the chest or whatever. And then you got to stop. You can't just fully unload a full magazine or 6 rounds into somebody once they're on the ground. There's many cases that people have done that and wound up, you know, the first 2 rounds were fine. The 14 that followed, not so good. You know, like it's overkill. So, in my opinion, carry if you want to carry, but know that you should have insurance. Concealed carry insurance, hands down, that's something you should not even contemplate whether or not you need it. And you know, practice.
Sure. Oh yeah. I was just thinking about, Andy and I were just talking about, you know, ours before this call, and you know, I was just thinking about what you were talking about, is that, and even if I did started carrying again, you know, the reaction time, I'd have to practice, you know, myself. And I think a lot of times, you know, people don't, they just have it. They're like, oh, got it for protection. It's great. But, you know, at the end of the day, you know, it's your reaction time that really needs to improve if you're wanting to even protect yourself or somebody else.
And speaking of reaction time, I've totally derailed this conversation. My apologies.
I was honestly,
it's all good.
To get back to it, but I'm like, you know what? This is a great conversation. Let's continue. And then I'll be like, so by the way, and so anyways, that was a good.
They call me the
segue,
soul.
Andy.
So on that note, no, okay. So usually what I do with the podcast, now that we kind of got a little bit of an introduction to you and chatting about your marine life, or, you know, that kind of, what I'd like to actually start out with is knowing a little bit about who you were before you got in the military, and then kind of how it led you in getting into it. So I guess the question I want to ask you is, what were you like before the military, and what led you to choose getting into the military?
I was a mess. No, funny enough, so I'm a classically trained chef. I've been cooking professionally, I guess you could say, since I was about 14, started at 12. And I had wound up all over the country. This is, you know, pre-Google days, so there wasn't a lot of mobility in the chef world. And I wound up in Seattle, Washington, to go to the Art Institute of Seattle. So along came, so I was 21, along came 9/11. and the whole world shut down, of course. And I come from a pretty strong military background. No one in my direct family, but grandparents, all the way back down to the 1700s. We've served in every major place in the world, and almost, I think, every branch. And 9/11, I remember I had like a black and white TV, right? And I was listening to National Public Radio, and all of a sudden they broke the broadcast, and they're like, something's going on with the Pentagon or something. We don't even know. And then I like tuned in, and I watched the second plane hit, the Twin Towers, and I was like, holy shit, the Russians or somebody has really stepped up their game. And to fast forward, I spent another year and a half in the chef world, and I got into a terrible car accident, kind of stole my my profession from me. And back then I listened to a lot of radio, and just hearing the news reports consistently coming back with folks on the ground, it really started to wear on me. And I started having some conversations with my grandfather, who's a Marine. He was all over the Pacific Islands, of course. And, finally I kind of came to an interesting crossroads, and I said, I feel like I've got to do something. And I was 25 years old. I had no idea if I was physically fit or whatever to join the Marines, but that was where I went. I walked over to my recruiter back in Easley, South Carolina. And I walked in, and I was like, dude, I want to join the Marines. And he kind of looked at me, and he's like, nope, no tattoos, nope, no piercings, nope, criminal record, nope, high school diploma, yep. Why do you want to join the Marines? Like, I was like, look, man, this war's going on, and my family's got a big history. And he was like, well, what do you want to do? I'm like, let's do infantry. And he's like, you're kind of old. Let's do the ASFAB. And so I was like, what's that? I'd done no research, really. I just thought I could walk in and like swear in and be on my way. And so I took the ASFAB, and he got the results back. Called me. He's like, dude, you did really well. Your GT is like a 105. So for those that you don't know, like 100's pretty excellent. It pretty much opens every door. And anything above that, you can start really aiming for the stars, like Space Force guys, I guess. And he brought me in the office, and he's like, I'd gone through like medical. So I passed medical screening, and he said, look, he opened like the big book of the jobs of the Marines. And he's like, see, you could be an accounting clerk, or you could be, a meteorologist. And no hate on anybody, but I was just like, I didn't even know the Marines had these jobs. Like, what?
Either.
What do you mean? Like,
I'm surprised by those ones.
I was like, a dispersing clerk. That does not really, in my mind, say Marine. Much love to you guys for making sure my pay was good every year. But at the end of the day, I was like, no, man, I'm good with infantry. So I actually joined January 16th, 2010 or 2006 is when I swore in. And I think that was like 72 years to the day my grandfather set foot in Camp New River, North Carolina, which was then, which is now like Camp New River outside of Camp Lejeune. So I joined like literally, the same day he did, and wound up in a very awful place called Parris Island, which was a great education in itself. So that's kind of who I was and how I got there,
Wow. Okay. Yeah, it's always interesting hearing people's, I don't know, I like the word origin stories, but the origin story of how somebody got into the military, because you kind of know who they were before. And knowing you're a chef, that's actually pretty interesting, because Andy is really interested in cooking. He actually has his own show. Pardon your fork? Pardon my fork?
Pardon my fork.
Pardon my fork.
We're big time competitors too, into the World Food Championships twice. So
Dang.
probably should talk to you about being on our show as well, Gavin.
Anytime.
And might I just say real quick, you're actually not the first person to say that you wanted to be infantry and not something else. We've had another guest on this show that was the same way. Could have taken a cushier stateside job and said, "No, I want to be infantry."
Yeah, which is
I
interesting.
just felt like
yeah.
I wanted the full experience, I guess. You know, I wanted to be a warrior and go to Valhalla, God forbid, you know, and I had no idea what the hell I was getting myself into, you know. It was awesome.
I'm interested to hear about like your first couple of days in the military, like how that went.
You mean real big boy Marine Corps or boot camp?
Boot camp.
Oh my God.
Like,
I would say that most movies almost capture the insanity that happens, right? Like I was just watching one, I forget who narrates it. He's a famous actor, older guy. You know, so everyone arrives at Paris Island at night, and Paris Island is located practically in a swamp in South Carolina. So, you know, I figured like, dude, I'll join in January. The weather will be pretty awesome. And big mistake there because it's actually cold sometimes. And then you get there and like it's like no joke. There is nonstop screaming. You are not talking to anybody. And you know, you get the whole head shaven thing. And then the first thing that I'm reminded of was I had no idea I had like high arches, right? So they have everyone line up and it's not at full capacity. There's more buses still coming in. And so they have us go step on like this scale and it measures the arch of your feet or whether you have flat feet or whatever. And they don't tell you this. And so they just say, come here. And then they like write a number on your hand. And I'm like, oh my God, what does this number mean? And lo and behold, you know, they gave me these awesome Go Fasters, which is Marine lingo for tennis shoes that have like arch support built into them.
Okay.
So I'm already like sidelining myself. Another fun fact that I love is that so I wear glasses and my vision is so bad, like they have to, you know, go God knows where to find the right portholes, as we call them in Marine speak, for some glasses. So one thing to not do in the Marines is to sideline yourself and make sure that people know who you are consistently. So here I am a couple weeks into boot camp and I still have my civilian portholes. And that's what they called me half the time was, come here, civilian portholes, come here. And you're like, yay, me, thanks.
Name.
And then I had like the total like Drew Carey, like giant glasses because I'm so damn blind. But I think the most pivotal thing that they do, I'm not sure if this is still how it looks like, but the first couple of days, it's just a blur. You have like no sleep. People are yelling at you. You're like a kindergartner. And then you start like, you get your gear and you start like marching and you're like, dude, this is the Marines. Like this is not okay. I got this. Like, you're like, this is no big deal. And then I think it's Black Sunday, maybe Black Thursday. I forget. But they take you to your home and you kind of like know how to make a rack and whatever. And then they sit us all down and you're like nut to butt, like kindergartners. And that's when you meet your senior drill instructor. And this guy comes out and he's like a robot. The creases in his clothes, which of course I now know all the secrets, are so sharp that you're like, dude, if he touches me, he's going to cut me with those. And he comes out and he does what's called the senior drill instructor, like Thomas, and he tells you about like what he's going to do and how he's going to form you into a Marine, da 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 da. And then he introduces what I had a kill hat and a drill hat. So two guys who are kind of early or medium in their career of being a drill instructor until they earn their black belt. And then at that time, he introduces them to us, and then it's like a Mortal Kombat move. He goes, drill instructors, take them. And then it was like mayhem. He like steps back and these guys come out and they're like picking us up and throwing us and boot kicking us around. And like it was, at that moment that I was like, what the hell have I done? Like, oh my God.
What did I get myself
Wow.
into?
Oh my God. I was like, and that's the funny thing. Everyone's like, dude, I could never be a Marine. I'm like, actually, when you get to Paris Island, you can't leave. Like, the easiest way to get out of there is to earn your Eagle Globe and Anchor. Like, I broke my finger training day like 27, so right before we head off to the rifle range, and so I wound up staying at that lovely place for an extra month. It's like the worst vacation of my life, but yeah, it was awesome. And then when we earn our Eagle Globe and Anchor after the Crucible, and we actually become Marines, it's like the coolest thing ever. I mean, if people are lying, if they're like, if they don't shed a tear, maybe they're not full on like crying, but it's a pretty pivotal moment.
Interesting. So what is that experience like when you actually like finish with basic and all?
So it depends on what you're doing. If you're an infantry, you automatically we got some boot leave where we go home for a couple of days. And then we actually go to the School of Infantry, right? So unlike like all my friends in the Army who kind of like were in the infantry from the day one, and they kind of train with the same people who are also going into being those 11 Bravos, we're actually in a group of like 60 other people that could be going all over to various different areas. So they go to something called AIT, like advanced, I don't know, something training. But we wound up in Camp New River, Camp Geiger, to be kind of what they call a Geiger Tiger when you're going through the School of Infantry. And so, if my memory serves me, it's like 8 weeks. So you get there and you kind of have a little freedom, but not so much. They keep us pretty locked down for like the first 2 or 3 weeks, and then we kind of earn libo for the weekends. And very quickly, it's like, welcome to infantry. Here are these things, and here's what you're going to do. And I'm like, okay, cool. And then it came like, it was like Christmas. They're like, all right, now that you're here, you can actually do a couple different choices. They said, here are the 0331s. These are the machine gunners. And they've got like a 240 Bravo out there, 50 cal, Mark 19. I'm like, man, that shit looks heavy. Can I cuss on this? I don't even know.
Oh, you
But
can.
whatever. All right, I'm a Marine, so sometimes it slips. And I'm like, man, that stuff looks heavy.
This is
right?
a free speech zone. This is what we call it.
Okay. And so I'm like, yeah, I don't know about being a machine gunner. It looks cool, but it looks heavy. And then they brought out like the mortars, the 41s, the 0341s, and they brought out like the 40 millimeter and 80 millimeter, and I'm like, death from afar. That looks lame. Not for me. And then they brought out the assaultman, right? So I'm a 0351, and so they bring out this stupidest weapon ever created on Earth called a SMA. It's a Mark 153. It's a shoulder-fired weapon. It's like the Mac Daddy of the AT-4, right? This thing shoots an 83 millimeter rocket, multiple different heads, and it's really weird. It's got a spotting scope and tracer rounds built into it, so it's this big dumb rocket that you shoot on complete Kentucky windage. Every time I shot one of these things, I was like aiming at the ground and somehow hit what I was doing, because for those of you who don't know what Kentucky windage is, sometimes your sights are off, or if your scope is jacked up, you can actually use tracer rounds to gauge where you're actually shooting. So the Mark 153 is like the dumbest thing ever. But then they were like, but there's more. And you're like, really? And they're like, oh yeah, see this is a block of C4, and here's TNT, and you get to learn how to play with plastic explosives. And I'm like, check mark number 2. And then they're like, and here's this backpack full of grenades that you run up to maybe a minefield or a clearing that you need to like clear from barbed wire, and you wear this backpack. It's 2 men who run up. It's called an APOBS device. It's got like 84 grenades in it, I think. And you run up and you set the stupid thing down, and then it shoots out in a big fire hose of grenades and helps to clear paths. So I was like, I'm sold. This is what I got to do. Oh,
Sign me up for that.
That was check 3, and then they go, oh, there's more. How about a Benelli shotgun and a breacher's kit? So not only did I get to do anti-tank, anti-armor destruction, I got to do dynamic breaching with explosives. Like my favorite one is the IV explosive, where you pack 2 IVs with a bunch of C4 and actually use water to implode doors. But we also got to do mechanical breaching as well. So I got it all, baby. It was awesome.
That sounds amazing. I wouldn't have thought that, you actually get to more or less pick what you want to do.
So there's kind of a system to weed out those. Number one, you have to have a specific GT score to do any of our heavier stuff. And then the whole time we're being watched by our training cadre. There's a lot of land nav. So if you don't do well on land nav, I don't know what that has to do with being a good machine gunner, but whatever. Or even an assaultman. And then the whole time, once you get into the assaultman course, dude, it's a lot of math. And everything is if you don't pass these math tests, which is not my forte, let me split tablespoons, cups, ounces, whatever, I'm good. But we're figuring out how much det cord you need to create X number of seconds to blow something open. And you're like, oh man, study. And we got all these calculations. And then the worst thing happens.
Kevin, that kind of sounds like a recipe to me.
It sounds like what?
A recipe.
It was a recipe, but you're like, oh my God, I'm going to be in combat and I've got to figure out the amount of plastic explosive I need to create what's called an abattis, which is blowing open trees to create obstacles for tank tracks. I don't know where we do that right now, but whatever. And it was tough. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, we sweated it out because it's no calculators are allowed on the testing, and you're like, damn. And then you make it to big boy Marine land, right? Yeah. And you're all like, I know all these cool things, and I know all these formulas, and my most senior person in my platoon, in my assault platoon, is a lance corporal. So he's an E3. I'm an E2, right? And he's like, Boot, what's the formula for calculating, C4, blah, 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 with this kind of steel, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, blah, 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 blah. And he's like, wrong answer. And I'm like, oh my God, I've screwed up. He goes, P equals plenty. P equals plenty is the only formula you will ever need to know to do this job. And I was so angry because we spent weeks calculating all of these things, and we had little charts that they gave us to carry around with us. And then you get to big boy Marine land and they're like, P equals plenty. That's it, baby.
You're like,
mind really? Blown. Oh, I was so mad.
You're like, really?
Oh my God.
Okay,
it was awesome.
That's all I have to do now? Great.
Yeah. They're like, just take a whole satchel and put it on there and get a bunch of det cord and make it happen. Split up. Like, okay. Got it.
We're not going to give you any time to calculate. You're just going to do it. You're like, okay.
You're like, oh, cool. I don't know. Yeah, so that was kind of the whole thing. And then you graduate. So one of the killer things that we do a lot of is doing a lot of humping. So that's carrying heavy things in rucksacks a lot. I think the biggest one we did in School of Infantry is 20 kilometers, which is not a huge amount, but it still sucks when you got 90 pounds of gear on you and then you're carrying the small. I think it weighed 27 pounds, and one rocket full of sand weighed another 13. So needless to say, I appreciated every single person that fell out of every hump because it allowed me to continue to endure for the few seconds that you had as a rest pause break. And then You graduate and it's like no big deal. And then I think they do this on purpose. They're like, all right, assaultmen, there's a great need for you in the Marine Corps, which was lie number one. Because there's not a lot of us, and the way the Marine Corps promotes people is through this just archaic system called boat spacing. And they're like, you guys are all going to go to Hawaii. And I'm like, yes, I want to go there. This sounds great. And then, so my last name's Tice. And so I've always been screwed by the alphabet. So they were like, the day came for us to get our assignments. They're like, oh, we were just kidding about going to Hawaii. None of you are going there. Wah, wah, wah. And at the time, they had just stood up a new, I don't know if we could call it a unit, but it was something called the Anti-Terrorist Task Force Battalion or something like that. And so it was like, all right, if your last name starts with an A all the way down to like S, you're going to ATB. And I was like, seriously? And then two of the guys look at me and a couple of my machine gunner buddies, and they're like, oh man, you guys are going to 2-2 golf. Good luck with that. And we're just like, what does that even mean? So we were like the only 3 guys who wound up on a bus going to mainland Camp Lejeune. And we got to a unit that had been hit so hard in Fallujah that they made us go on what's called a MU, a Marine Expeditionary Unit. And literally our most senior leadership, like we're a bunch of E3s and newly promoted E4s because we just got devastated with KIAs and wounded in actions. So it was a very interesting couple first days in the Marine Corps.
Wow.
Let me tell you. Yeah.
Interesting. So what was the rest of your career like? I mean, how long were you in?
Yeah, I did 4 years. Shoulda, coulda, woulda done more when I look back at what I could have done, but you don't know what you don't know. And I think I dodged plenty of bullets, along the way. So, like I said, we wound up in a unit that was training for a MU. And so a MU is responsible for, I don't know, 20 different operations. I always tell people it looks like this. If there's an embassy that's getting attacked or something else, they call in the MU to come in and pull everybody out of the embassy. So that's like the biggest mission that most people would have anything or any real idea about what we do. But essentially there's a ton of MUs out in the world at any given time. And we're responsible for pretty much being the absolute crushing force if anything goes wrong. We can be pretty much anywhere within 24 hours, anywhere in the world that the Marine Corps needs to be. And a lot of people don't know, but the President of the United States can actually engage the Marines only for 30 days without congressional approval. So we can be anywhere within 24 hours and they can let the dogs loose for 30 days without even needing money back from Congress.
Oh, wow.
So we did that. That was a pretty awesome, I guess, tour. The main point of that was everybody got to come home, right? Everybody. We were stood up constantly to go back and be a force for theater and reserve, but never actually made it into any kind of real situation in Afghanistan or Iraq. And then we came home, trained up, and we're back in Iraq in 2008. And we were in a pretty large size AO. Came home from that and then got kicked out because they didn't need me because I wasn't re-upping and I wasn't re-enlisting. So I wound up being a motor vehicle traffic clerk for the last 8 months of my career in the Marines, which is, again, not a fun journey. I'd never worked with people outside of the infantry. I hadn't worked with any females. So it was a whole different world. And really what they did is they took a lot of wounded warriors and put them in this position. And it was not cool at all. And then I got out in 2010 and I did the next best thing that every Marine wants to do in the infantry. I went overseas as a security contractor, made it my job to get there. I spent a couple months in the green zone in Baghdad and realized that the IT guy, he made 6 times the amount of money I did.
Oh shit.
Think about that. Like, everyone's like, dude, I want to be Mr. Gucci, you know? And I mean, it's part of a rapid response team.
Yeah.
Actually, in the beginning, I had 120 Ugandans, the Jumbo guys, right, who guarded every DFAC chow hall under my hand. I was a watch officer, and I was like, this is not for me. And so I wound up hanging out with some Brits, New Zealander, and a couple like civilians who wound up being security contractors. Bizarre. On a rapid response team. And, you know, I got to see a lot more of Baghdad and in the green zone. And then that terrible realization that here I was making pretty good money. But compared to the IT guy who had zero, I mean, he had like a 1% chance that some, you know, random rocket might collapse his building. That was it. And he was making $625,000
Oh
just
shit.
to, you know, control internet on a base. I was like, I am in the wrong damn job. And so I was like, screw this. I'll go home and use my GI Bill. You know?
Yeah.
I was done. I mean, I lived that dream. I looked cool. Yeah, no. IT is not for me.
Oh.
But so yeah, that I kind of left all of that aside. And I mean, I wasn't working for like, you know, Blackwater or whoever they were at that time, Academy maybe. I had some friends that transitioned to like Triple Canopy and Z and all the different iterations that Blackwater had been, but I wasn't willing. I mean, like, I just kept looking around. I'm like, dude, this money is not really all that it could be, and like, all this money is great if you're alive to spend it. But we got some pretty interesting scraps, and like after I left, my guys who stayed there, I mean, they got hit with like 125 rockets that Christmas. You know, just I mean, and it was always crazy. Like, you know, what terrorists were left, they were targeting like just random stuff. They would fill a mortar with water, put a mortar round in there, and then freeze it. And so they'd leave it on top of a building or a truck. And, you know, when it finally melted enough to hit the punch plate, it would launch. And it was crazy. So I was like, screw this. I'm going home. I'll be something. I'm going to be a leader because I'm a Marine and people recognize Marines as leaders. So that was my exit out of the military.
That's quite an exit from the military. I actually thought about that when I got out of the military, was because I had went to Afghanistan in 2015 or 2015. And I saw some of the guys that were contractors and, you know, they're making pretty good money. And I actually thought about that as when I got back, I'm like, when I get out, I'm like, oh, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go out, you know, become a contractor. And never did, but I always thought it was pretty cool. You know, the conversation with the wife didn't really go over well about wanting to be a contractor. So I was like, no, okay, good. I'll just, anyways, I'll just come back home and start my civilian life. But yeah, cool. Yeah, that I guess the it's interesting the transition out of the military, you know, and did you find that conversations? Okay, so when you were mentioning when you went into the your last unit or whatever for the last 8 months, and being able, you know, you were around women before, and now you're around women, and you know, conversations. Did you find out the conversation was a lot different versus with infantry?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, it was just a different world. Like, I worked with MPs, and you know, the typical idea of the MPs is we just don't like them because they're jerks. And a lot of us in my unit wound up, like, some guys actually wound up being on the gates and manning the gates. And I had this like cush job giving people base passes. which was perilous sometimes. Like there's nothing
Yeah.
like telling like a Korea vet that he can't come on base because he doesn't have military ID. And I was like, this is jacked up, you know? But they were, you know, those folks were really still working on their careers. And they looked at us as kind of like less than human because they're like, oh, great, another grunt guy coming here. He's going to be here for a couple months and be gone. Like, so, I mean, I worked with a good crew of people, but it was just very different to be around people kind of chasing a career, being like a military police person or something.
Sure.
Mhm.
Now, on the other end of it, so getting out of the military and, you know, finding out in the conversations you had with people, was it a lot different? You know, did you feel like you had like a, I don't know, like a transition period of time to be able to figure out how best to communicate with people?
No.
No.
You know, when I went through Steps and Taps, it was like a joke.
Mm.
Because I knew how to do like the resume thing and interview and stuff from being a chef, and it's not like you lose that. I
Yeah.
wouldn't call it a skill set, but those abilities. You know, and here's what I found out, and what kind of hit me like a ton of bricks is I didn't have many friends in South Carolina. I didn't grow up there, but the people I did know there, I showed back up, you know, 4.5 years later, just to like go home and hang out with my parents for a couple of days before I went back to the beach. And it was like I'd been on some really strange, you know, camping trip for a couple of years. Their lives had continued to move forward, right? Some had gotten married by then, new jobs, went on to get a master's degree. And, you know, when you join the military, that your civilian world kind of stops for you. And then you disappear. And then you come home, maybe for a couple weeks or something. But when you leave the military and you go back home, their lives have moved on.
Sure.
And, you know, like it's almost like you're picking back up right from the day that you walked away. And that was a pretty big struggle because they, of course, want to hear all like, oh, what was it like? But, you know, like it takes a while to really assimilate back into civilian world, civilian culture. And I mean, I started having a lot of problems, and you know, things just weren't going well for me. At one point I wound up living in my truck. um you know, I wasn't without resources, but I really just was in a bad place, and I was like, well, I'll go to school. So I started going to school and I had like no path. I was like, well, psychology sounds cool. And you know, over the time, like I wound up leaving North Carolina because I had a relationship end, and it just seemed like a good time to like cut all ties. And then I'm like, okay, cool. I'll go to school. I'll get this GI Bill. I'll get a job, and you know, like I'll save money.
Yeah.
And I went through like 45 interviews.
Oh shit.
And I'm thinking like, dude, I'm a Marine. I lead people, you know, like, and everyone's like, so, it says here you went to Iraq. Yep. Oh. Well, thank you, Mr. Tice. This has been a great conversation. You know, we'll be in touch. And you're like, but wait a second. I had one interview where a guy said, so it says you're a disabled vet. What's your disability? And I was like,
Oh no.
boy, you can't really ask, you know? I was like, and that's a no-go. I wound up working at Lowe's, the home construction place, for $7.13 an hour. They were the only people that would hire me part-time. And it was the first place I'd ever worked where people didn't show up on payday. So like I'm in the job for like 2, maybe 3 weeks. I had to do like crazy amounts of interviews. You know, they had to teach me how to use a cash register. And I'm sitting there and like I show up on a Friday and they're like, hey, Gavin, you're the only register for the night. It was like from 3 to 10. And I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah, everyone called in sick. And so, you know, I'm talking to like Bob, one of the stalker guys, and I'm like, Bob, like, it's weird. No one showed up today for work. He goes, yes, payday Friday. And I'm like, okay.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like, yeah, a lot of people don't come to work on payday Friday. And I'm like, and they still had a job? And he's like, yeah. And like, lo and behold, like Lowe's would call me all the time. They're like, hey, people didn't show up to work. Can you come in?
You're
And
like,
like,
oh,
sometimes I would, but sometimes I'm like, dude, I got to study. Like, and it became like my 20 hours would start creeping into 30 on the schedule. And I'm like, whoa, I can't. And like, I had a kid coming and I had a beautiful fiance, and like, that was not working out. So I found out I could do a federal work study job.
oh,
So I actually got paid like $6 an hour to go hang out in what's called a vet center.
Hmm.
I answered the phones, made coffee, and got to talk to vets from Korea on up. Like,
oh, God.
it was my entire job, and study, of course.
Mm.
And because that was a non-taxable job, I actually made more money at $6 an hour than at $7.13 an hour, working my ass off at Lowe's.
Mm.
And so I wound up doing that for, I guess, close to 2 years. I was also part of a veteran nonprofit at the time. I was a mentor to veterans who were in a treatment program who'd gotten involved in the judicial system.
Okay.
And then I graduated from school. I got 2 degrees, one in social work and one in psychology. And I wound up getting a job at the VA pretty quickly and working in the mental health team. So that's how I transitioned out of like a civilian nightmare back into the federal system.
I can understand the Lowe's aspect, because I actually worked at Home Depot.
Mm-hmm.
And long story short, I was being the forklift. Like, I was asking to be trained in the forklift, and they weren't training me in the forklift. And they bring new guys, and they train the guys in the forklift. And I look at them and go, "Are you going to train me in the forklift, right?" And they're like, "Well, yeah, we'll get you eventually." And I'm like, "Okay, so here's the deal. I'm a track mechanic. Like, I was trained in the military to be a track mechanic." And you're like, it was long, but it was crazy. But I understand the whole, like, people calling in all the time, and you're like, really?
And
Okay.
I would get in trouble because like a customer would come up to me and they'd be like, hey, I'm looking for this widget. And I've been up and down the aisles and I've asked a couple people and they don't seem to know where it is. And I'm like, I don't know where it is, but let's go.
Mhm.
And like, I would leave my register and go help them find the widget. And then I'd hear, Gavin, to your register, please. Gavin, to your register. And I'd like show back up and they're like, where were you? And I'm like, well, that customer needed these widgets and no one else would help them find it. And they're like, yeah, you can't leave your register. And I'm like, but we're all about like helping the customer. And they're like, well, they could have been helped by somebody else. I'm like, but no one would help them.
Yeah.
And that became like the thing. I'm like, but you want me to like, I was like, maybe I shouldn't be a register guy, So I don't know. And
Yeah.
I was happy to leave the Lowe's environment, but big shout out to them for hiring me because nobody else would.
Yeah. I mean, that I can understand. So what led you into what you currently do now?
Well, so I went into mental health at the VA, had a family move to Chicago, and I wound up working for the Department of the Navy in another mental health role. I was actually a SARC, so I was like the most dangerous man on any base. And then we had another family move to Columbus, Ohio, where I'm currently at.
Mm.
And I showed up here, couldn't have my same job either in the VA or with the Navy. And I struggled. Like, again, it was kind of like this weird thing. I had degrees, but I don't have master's degrees in social work or psychology. couldn't find any real work. And then I got in touch with the Veterati on LinkedIn and started talking to some mentors, and they're like, hey man, I think you'd be really good in sales. And I'm like, dude, I'm a social worker, I don't do sales.
Sure.
And they're like, well, tell me about like what you did in being a counselor and doing what you did. And I'm like, well, I'd sit down with a patient. They generally had a problem that they thought they had. I would ask them a lot of questions to really dig into what happened, um, figure out a solution for them or a couple varieties of solutions, try to close them on it. They would be like, I don't want to take drugs, or, I don't want to go to counseling or whatever. And then, I'd have to follow up with them and like build a plan to make sure that they maintained it. And I also did like a lot of public speaking, and I did a lot of classes where I was a facilitator. And they were like, what do you think sales looks like, dude? And I'm like, oh. And they're like, yeah, you meet a prospect, you do, and I mean, now this is like old school selling that does not work. Let me tell you right now. But the typical fashion is you meet someone, you engage with them, you ask them questions, you find out their challenges or their needs, you create a value added solution.
Mm.
Then you attempt to close them, or well, let me take a step back. You give them your value added solution, you demo them or walk them through some kind of presentation, you attempt to close them, they give you a bunch of objections, and then you handle them, and then you follow up with them, and then they disappear on you. Much like counseling.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, this is a no brainer. And so I wound up finding my first like business development job with a local veteran-owned company here, a tech company. And then that was pretty cool. And then I moved on from there to another company. And then I realized like all the books and like the weekend seminars and crap that I did was not actually moving the needle. And so I invested in myself. I found a coach as far away from me as humanly possible in the United Kingdom. And so I was introduced to Sandler Sales and how we do things. And then had, I like to say, a meteoric rise. I like tripled my income in 1 year. Went from like a BDR to a territory account executive. It was awesome. And then COVID hit, and my coach said, look, you just got riffed. Maybe you should come on to the dark side and become a Sandler wizard. And here I sit now, trying to help a million different veterans and entrepreneurs, excel their business and all that good stuff.
Gosh. That's a lot, but it's a great story though.
Long answer to say everything I learned in social work and psychology is all sales, and it helps me every day. But a lot of us just don't call daily life struggles sales. I've got young kids. They're constantly trying to sell me on stuff. I'm constantly handling them and their objections. We sell our partners on, making sure the magic stays in the relationship. Like, we're constantly in a sales process. We just don't call it that.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have thought that either. Thinking about it now, it's like, yeah, I think I've sold my wife a couple times.
Constant sale.
Yeah, constant sales. Baby, you're staying with me, right? No, not that I'm.
You got to upsell them. You got to upsell them. You got to cross sell them. You got to sell them on the new toys you want. Oh yeah, it's all sales.
That is too awesome. Cool. Well, that is. I'm trying to think of something else. I think we're good. I mean, I think I got a good handle on who you are, and
I think this was a good first episode.
Yeah, good first episode. I think we can definitely dive into more stuff with you.
Gavin, just right off the top of your head, I mean, from your own experience, do you have kind of a quick word of wisdom for anyone who's coming out of the military and was in a similar position to you where they're like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I guess I'll just pick something?
Yeah, the quick and dirty of that is you can try one of two ways, right? You can go into that field that you think you want to be in, and that's going to be everything you want. And the current rate, I think it's like 82% of veterans last a year or less in their first job post-military. The best way to do this is to find mentors and find veterans on LinkedIn and say, look, I'm a transitioning veteran. I love to jump in your field. I don't know enough about it. Could we have a virtual cup of coffee? Let me ask you some questions. That will open up so many doors. The hard part about that is being patient and waiting for those people to respond, because, you know, we've got lives, we've got companies, we've got businesses. So we might not get back to you immediately, but, you know, a week later, give us a little knock, you know. But there's a ton of great people to connect with on LinkedIn. Use these resources that are out there, and you can't start your transition early enough.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard starting your transition even when you're in the military, you know, before you get out. That way you're like, okay, well, at least you have those conversations and reach out to those people that, you know, can help you out.
That's some really good advice.
Yeah.
I wish someone had told me that.
Right? You're like, please, I need to know this. So yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I've been kind of leading into with this podcast now is, you know, the resources in the transition, you know, process is really kind of getting that out to people, especially with, you know, with LinkedIn and different, you know, mediums that we can use to be able to reach out to people. And that's, you know, like our first conversation was it yesterday, you know, just really knowing those people that you can talk with and to really hone in on what you should do and the connections and that kind of thing. So
for sure.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on to the podcast, and we can definitely talk more. We're gonna just scratching the surface, I think, of what our conversations can be. So
all these conversations are. I mean,
yeah,
it's just when you're doing it an hour at a time, you're just scratching the surface.
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, there's some podcasts out there, some veteran podcasts like that are like like 3 to 6 hours of just. I've seen it. It's crazy. Like these actually record for 6 hours, and I'm like, that's some pretty in-depth shit. Like, to be honest. But yeah, so I mean, we'll have to bring you back on and see what we can come up with for conversation. So
sounds fantastic. Always happy to jump on.
Cool. Well, appreciate it, Gavin, and everybody. Thank you for listening, and this has been a wonderful episode with Gavin. So any comments would be great on this episode. So as always, thank you for tuning in, and thank you for likes and subscribes, and just make sure you share it out to all your networks. So thank you, everybody.